This is the story of American freedom. Thus, on September the 17th, 1787, 39 delegates signed the Constitution of the United States. They were presided over by the moral authority of George Washington, guided by the wisdom of Benjamin Franklin and Roger Sherman, supported by the patriotism of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and their forward-looking view of a new era, a new form of government. But we must always remember that wise as they were, these 39 men did not give us the United States Constitution. No, it was the sturdy citizens of this country, those who had carried the revolution on their bayonets, whose ratification gave us the Constitution of the United States. It was they who, in their wisdom, ratified this new, almost radical form of government, creating a strong national government and a Congress capable of taxing. It was not ratified without debate. Already when the Constitution first appeared in the newspapers, there appeared in a New York newspaper a letter signed by Julius Caesar praising this Constitution. Almost certainly it was written by Governor Clinton of New York, and it was a means of saying that only a would-be tyrant would want this Constitution. There were many patriotic Americans who had been leaders in the Revolution who were opposed to it. None more so than Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who had put forth the resolution for the Declaration of Independence of the United States. He and others got lumped under the general name of anti-federalist. If you're anti-anything, generally it weakens your case. But their case made a great deal of sense. It argued, for example, that the Constitution was too complicated to work, that Congress was given far too much authority, that the idea of creating a federal capital would lead to a modern-day Rome with huge public buildings arising next to squalid tenements. But their very wise opposition to the Constitution called forth a body of literature unsurpassed in the annals of history, equal to Plato and Aristotle. The Federalist Papers, written by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison as a response to these criticisms, gradually collected, first published in New York newspapers, gradually collected these more than 80 essays, argued cogently why this Constitution would work, why the executive was not given too much authority, how much the states were interwoven into this Constitution. The first state to ratify was brave little Delaware. Do you remember we saw Caesar Rodney riding through the cold and rain to sign the Declaration of Independence, breaking the tie with the Delaware delegation? What was his reward? Why, he appears on the Delaware Quarter. Yes, who did you think that was riding on the back of the Delaware State Quarter? Some jockey? A racetrack? No. And now, once again, brave little Delaware. The Delaware men, by the way, had held the line at Guilford Courthouse. In fact, what is the name of their football squad? The Blue Hens. That was what the Delaware militia was called. So brave were they in fighting. And so it was they who first ratified it on December the 7th, 1787, by unanimous vote. Here was this little bitty state getting the same number of votes, too, in the Senate as great New York or Massachusetts or Virginia. Georgia followed next. It was a large state in terms of territory, ultimately, but very small in its population. So both Delaware and Georgia knew they were never going to get a better deal. Not so New York and Virginia. Virginia was very, very upset over this new Constitution, in which Virginia was relegated to what was seen as a second-class status, the Old Dominion. But one by one, the states ratified it, and finally, by June, Virginia decided it ought to be the 9th state. That was the number taken to get the Constitution working. But even there, they failed. Little New Hampshire slid in behind them, and there they were, not even to gain that little bit of renown. 2 states did not sign it. One was North Carolina. They raised the objection that was heard in all of the ratifying conventions. Where is a Bill of Rights? Where is a bill outlining our individual rights? Even under King George, we had such a Declaration of Rights, giving us fundamental freedoms such as trial by jury, the writ of habeas corpus. Where is such a Bill of Rights? And it must be admitted that those who had attended the convention and now were at their ratifying conventions had very weak answers. So North Carolina would not sign until such a Bill of Rights was there. Rhode Island would have nothing to do with the thing at all. They were still Rogues Island, wanting their cheap currency, and would have to be ultimately forced into the Union by a trade embargo. But in the other states, the ratifying conventions agreed that they would sign, but on the verbal promise that the first Congress meeting under this new Constitution would provide a Bill of Rights. Now, would you today be willing to sacrifice your freedoms on the verbal promise of a bunch of politicians? Never. But they understood that these were men of honor. But what was still most important was to prove that this complicated Constitution worked with all its checks and balances. And thus, the supreme test came with the first Congress. With the inauguration of George Washington and the first Congress, the Congress of 1789. What a task loomed before it. It had, one, to prove that this Constitution would work. 2, it had to create this Bill of Rights. 3, it had to deal with the vast territories, the Northwest territories, that had come into the new country. It had to provide a means of organizing them, the Northwest and Southwest territories, stretching out to the Mississippi. And perhaps most importantly, it had to deal with a national debt of $73 million incurred in the course of the Revolutionary War. Now, in terms of inflation and the ability of a country at that time to raise money, this was a national debt equal to what we have today. Well, first came the question of this national debt. It was bitterly controversial. It was divided into the following parts. A considerable portion, $14 million, was owed to foreign governments, above all France and Holland. Then there were those debts owed to individuals by the revolutionary government. And then there were those debts owed by states to individuals. So those owed by the revolutionary government to individuals, those owed by states, and those owed by this new country to its foreign supporters. Well, for these men of honor, this debt to France and Holland was a debt of honor, and it was paid immediately in hard currency of gold and silver. But far more difficult was the question of these debts to individual merchants, because many of these debts had been bought up by speculators. That is to say, you had been willing to lend $1,000 to the revolutionary government. But by 1785, you thought you were never going to get your money back. So you were willing to sell that bond of $1,000 to a speculator for $100. Well, that speculator maybe in a year decided he'd never get his money back. After all, in 1786, the country was in a severe financial crisis. So perhaps he sold it for $10. $10 was better than nothing. Now the question was, how was this going to be paid back? If it was paid back to the actual holder of the bond at the moment, he had paid only $10 for a $1,000 bond. Are you following this, yes or no? You sure? Well, many members of Congress said this is outrageous. Why should we line the pocket of these speculators? But Alexander Hamilton had been appointed by George Washington as his Secretary of Treasury. Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. Not a partisan statement, just a statement of fact. What would we not give for a Jefferson and a Hamilton in those positions today? So Hamilton was the one entrusted with coming up with a financial plan, and he relied very heavily on the advice of Robert Morris, who had essentially financed a good part of the American Revolution. And don't let anybody ever tell you that these men financed it to get rich. Robert Morris would end his days in debtor's prison. And so the question was, how do we pay it back? And Hamilton argued as forcefully as possible that unless we paid back the full value to the actual bondholder of the moment, the credit of the United States would never be any good again. And so, after much discussion, it was done. Then came the even more difficult question: what to do with the debts owed by the states? For some states, like Virginia, had been very good in paying off their debts. Others had not. They were spendthrift states that had not met their obligations. And here the controversy was even more bitter. Virginia was deeply opposed to paying back the debts of these states. Why should it assume these obligations? This seemed to be an intractable problem. But Washington called into his study Jefferson and Hamilton, talked to them briefly. He told them, "Gentlemen, I'd like to see you walk up and down in front of my window out there. And when you come back in and have tea, I want this matter solved." So they went back and forth. Jefferson said, "There is no way in the world the Virginians are going to go along with this. Just forget about it. It will destroy our entire credit," argued Hamilton. "That may be, but there is only so far they will be pushed." Hamilton said, "What if I could assure you that the new federal capital will be located along the Potomac River?" What? Yes, between Virginia and Maryland. But everybody knows it's going to be in Philadelphia. Robert Morris has a great deal of persuasion with the Pennsylvania delegation. I think he can swing the votes. Well, if that's the case, I'll swing Virginia. Politics, compromise. Compromised by two men who had some respect for each other, but had very different notions about government. But they compromised. And they could go back into Washington and tell him the compromise, and it worked. And so the new nation paid back its debt. Then Hamilton went on to establish a national bank and to establish a sound currency, based on the Spanish silver dollar. So that first Congress, meeting in those 2 years, solved this major financial crisis. Now let me ask you something there, son. Are 2 years longer in 1789 than they are today, yes or no? No. What does our Congress do in 2 years? What is the terrible phrase they use today? Kick the can down the road. These patriots did not kick the can. They solved the problem. And then the Northwest Territories, the Southwest Territories. All of Europe assumed that just as Great Britain ruled over its vast empire as an empire, the new United States would exploit and rule over these territories that have stretched out to the Mississippi. No, instead, these same congressmen came up with an imaginative idea that this would not be an empire of force, but an empire of liberty. And in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, ratified by this Congress, these lands, which would include wonderful states like Ohio and Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin, and the South states that would become Alabama and Mississippi, they would each be organized along regular lines. When a specific population had been reached, they would enter the Union as free and independent states, fully equal to all the original 13. In other words, it would truly be, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, an empire of liberty. So these two great questions were dealt with. But the Bill of Rights, that was a moral obligation as well. And James Madison, leading the committee, began to go through all of the various suggestions that had been sent in by the states. And ultimately, after ratification was done, the 10 articles were established. The first of these, for the Bill of Rights, is the charter of our individual freedom. Our freedom to live as we choose, as long as we harm no one else, and our freedom under the law. The first of these, of our charter of individual freedom, promised us that Congress would make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or the free exercise thereof, or prohibiting the freedom of the press and of speech, or the right of the people freely and peaceably to assemble for redress of grievances. Right there are our three most basic individual freedoms. Now let me tell you something. When the Bill of Rights was ratified, in the minds of the Congress and the Americans who ratified it, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of a religion meant simply this: Congress cannot make a law establishing some church, let's say the Episcopal Church, as the official church of the United States and use federal money to support it. It never imagined, and this would completely have refuted their belief in the free exercise of religion, that Congress, the Supreme Court, that any government body could prevent a group of citizens from standing up and saying a prayer. Now, that's controversial to say today, but that was their clear understanding. Now, we have seen that the Constitution, one of its principles is secularism. No religious tests can ever be required. But your free exercise of your religion in public, as long as you push it on nobody else, is guaranteed. And that was their concern. Your freedom of thought, your freedom of conscience, that is what they feared King George was doing, interfering with their freedom of conscience. And so, that was enshrined forever. And freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Jefferson said that if he had to judge or take a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, he would take newspapers. Freedom of speech was fundamental. I despise what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. However, the founders would also tell you what we have forgotten today, that for every freedom, there is a corresponding responsibility. Yes, the press has its freedom, but it has the responsibility to produce the whole of the truth and every side of the question. The founders, in all their wisdom, could never have imagined a press, a media, as powerful as we have today. And then that third, your freedom to assemble. That had been crucial to the American Revolution. Never give it up. Your freedom to come and tell the government in a peaceful way, you are wrong. But now, what is the second of these amendments? Something like a militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, don't get mad with me. That is simply the plainest sentence in the English language. Congress can make no law that in any way infringes the right of a citizen to keep and bear arms. Nor is it a coincidence that this is the Second Amendment. The First Amendment gives you your most fundamental individual rights, and the second is how these had been defended during the Revolutionary War. Now, we might say that our times have changed so much that this has become antiquated. So be it. Repeal it. But do not hamstring it by all sorts of rules and regulations. Congress, the Americans were clear of their right to bear arms, unfettered. The third of the amendments, the third of the Bill of Rights, forbids Congress from quartering soldiers in your home without your consent in time of peace or without lawful action in time of war. Now, that's barely understood today, but it had a special meaning for the American revolutionaries that is still pertinent today. That is to say, their objection was to King George, not only on the cheap, not wanting to spend the money for barracks, sticking soldiers in their houses, but to the fact that these soldiers were instructed to act as spies and to listen to what you said. And if you were a disloyal subject of the king, to report you. They were informants. Well, I wonder today if we don't need to consider again that Third Amendment as the government looks more and more into every corner of the individual's life. So that Third Amendment says that the federal Congress has no right to look into every aspect of your life if you want to interpret it broadly. If you want to interpret it narrowly, it just means Sergeant Smith can't show up at your door with some orders and say, you've got to give me room and board. But take it more broadly, and it questions the authority of the government to look so deeply into your own life. The fourth of these amendments secures your right to be safe in your home. It secures your right against unreasonable searches and seizures. Secures your right that such searches must be based upon a properly issued warrant. Now that goes right back to Magna Carta. And these next amendments were the determination of the ratifying conventions and the people of the United States that their ancient rights as Englishmen, as enshrined in Magna Carta of 1215 and the Declaration of Rights of 1689, would be secured. There was a proverb in England that the wind and rain could enter the home of the most humble Englishman, but the king in all his majesty may not. Your home is your castle, and the government must prove that it has the need to search that home. And then Amendment 5, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on the presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in time of war and in actual service. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Like Amendment 4, that every day guarantees fundamental rights of all Americans, going all the way back to Magna Carta and the English Declaration of Rights. You cannot be twice tried for the same offense. A grand jury must indict you. You cannot be forced to give evidence against yourself. You must have due process of law. And if the king or the government take your property, already in Magna Carta it is proclaimed you must have just compensation. Amendment 6, in all criminal prosecution, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. The accused has the right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with witnesses against him, and to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for the defense. How very different this is from Roman law, where you can be held to trial for anonymous accusations. Here we say a public trial. You know the charges in writing, and you have the right to an attorney, and you have the right to have witnesses come in your favor. These are fundamental. They are part of English common law. And the determination of the Americans to keep this English common law as the basis of their new republic, not to have it replaced by a code like the Roman Law Code. Amendment 7 reads, in suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by a jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise or re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. The common law, that basic fundamental statement of English rights. And the trial by jury. Americans believed that the right to serve on a jury and the duty to serve upon it was one of your most fundamental rights as an American citizen. They would be ashamed of us today when we disregard juries or when we don't want to spend the time serving on juries. That was essential to your freedom. And then 8, again, right back to Magna Carta. Excessive bail shall not be required, no excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment be inflicted. Already in Magna Carta, the Englishman is guaranteed that whatever fine or punishment is imposed upon him, it will be equal to the extent of his crime. And then 9 and 10, they recall us back to the fact that this Bill of Rights arose from the people's concern that Congress would become just as great a tyrant as King George III, and that their rights might be trampled upon. So Amendment 9 promises us that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, unless Congress has a power specifically delegated to it, you preserve all of your rights. The argument is always in favor of the maximum rights for the individual. In this, the Bill of Rights, the charter of our individual freedom. And finally, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Echoing and strengthening this view that Congress must be clearly delegated these powers, or that this delegation of power must be something that specifically denies a right to a state, such as the right to coin money. Otherwise, all rights are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Notice that the Constitution of the United States begins, "We the people." That the last statement of the founders in the Bill of Rights is the people. The American Revolution is founded upon the central idea that you are the government, that each and every American citizen is the government, and the power to change that government lies with the people. For every time we've used the word people in speaking of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, it means you, the individual. So you are the government. However, let us go back to the achievement of that first Congress. For presiding over all was the figure of the great Washington. He is the greatest president in our country's history because as the first president, everything he did set a precedent. That the president would not just be the executor of the will of Congress, but would set policy and argue for it. But the most important single precedent, he said, he created, was when the end of his second term came. You see, all the wise heads in Europe, they assumed that he would declare himself to be indispensable. And there were many Americans who believed he was indispensable and were urging him to run for a third term. But in September of 1796, he took down to the Philadelphia Gazette a letter. In it, he said simply, "My fellow Americans, I am deeply honored by all the gifts that you have bestowed upon me. I am gratified that you wish for me to hold a third term, but that would not be appropriate. I will not run again. I am going back to my farm, going back to my life as a citizen of this country. I would leave my message there, except so deep a devotion do I feel towards you as my friends that I wish to give you some parting advice in this farewell address. I know how deeply rooted is the love of liberty in you, but I also know what may destroy that liberty. If we are to maintain that liberty, one, I urge you to avoid partisan politics. Do not form parties in this country. Partisan politics have been the destruction of every republic in history. Two, stay out of debt. Debt will destroy a nation just as surely as it will destroy an individual. And thirdly, stay out of foreign entanglements. Let us be a friend to everyone who wishes to be our friend. Let us carry out our commerce with everyone who wishes to trade with us. But stay out of other people's wars. And then, when his term was up, he went back to his beloved Mount Vernon and his beloved Martha. Visitors came in the scores, many of them British. They were always assured, he said, of a slice of mutton and a glass of wine. One of them commented, seeing him there, so erect, wearing his hair in the style of a soldier, listening to him discourse on politics, I judged him to be the greatest man of our day. And George III sitting to have his portrait painted, asked the artist, "What has happened to Washington?" "He has gone back to Mount Vernon." Then truly, he is the greatest man of our day. Within 2 years, he was dead. When news of his death reached Europe, France and Britain were at war. The British and French fleets were about to go into a great naval engagement. Suddenly, the French fleet lowered its flags. The British signaled over, "What's going on?" The French signaled back, "General Washington is dead." And then both fleets lowered their flags and for an hour had a truce in memory of the great Washington.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our Freedom and Heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.